Hi, I'm Jeff Gonzalez, president of Trident Concepts, and today I'm here with Brownells Daily Defense to talk to you about children and firearms. So this video is really going to be directed at those families who are interested in introducing firearms to their children. So I want to try to emphasize that there's a lot of things that we want to consider, and what I really want to emphasize to you is that this is a family decision. This is a decision that you need to have together, or that you need to be on the same sheet of music. And the most important thing that you do with this family decision is that you recognize that whatever kind of direction you're going to go with the introduction of firearms and your children, it needs to be age appropriate. And so what I can do is I can tell you my experience with my children and how I approach this. And it was a family-based decision, and we had a plan laid out that would take time to expose them gradually through this process. And so I want to share that with you because it's been extremely valuable, and I found out that it was actually very useful. So when it comes to the age appropriateness, again, that's where you need to have that discussion as a family and decide what do you want to introduce, at what point in the child's development do you want to introduce that, and realize that children have a difficult time understanding consequences with regards to negligent handling, negligent discharges with a firearm. And so it's really important that you make sure that they have at least an appropriate level of understanding about the topics that you're discussing. And there's several topics that you can introduce at young ages that don't cross a threshold that could potentially introduce negligence. So the first thing that we start with is we introduce safety. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that. The way that I did it was I had the kids basically learn, memorize, and recite on command the 4 cardinal safety rules. And it's one of those things where rote memorization doesn't necessarily mean comprehension. So once they had the rules kind of memorized, then we started to talk about what each rule meant and how the kids define that rule for themselves. In other words, when we talked about rule number 1, which is all guns were always loaded, I asked them to explain to me in their way what that meant and how they best could remember that rule. And once we did that, then the next thing we did was we exposed them to probably one of the best kids programs out there, which is the NRA Eddie Eagle. And I'm summarizing it, but basically it is 4 steps, right? First, stop. If you see a firearm unattended, stop. Don't touch. Leave immediately, and then tell your parents or an adult. And right there, trying to get that across to the children and the importance behind, don't touch the firearm. Something that's left unattended. Don't touch. So stop. Don't touch. Leave immediately, and then try to relay that information. One of the things that I talk about is my experience with the Eddie Eagle program, and I was sharing this with some of the guys where during the summer it was virtually unheard of to have the kids inside. They spent the entire day outdoors with their friends and all the other sports activities and whatnot. And I remember one time it was just me and my older, and he left. I heard the door slam. He's like, "I'm going to blow," and that's all I heard. He was out the door, and I expected that I would see him probably at the end of the day when he was hungry and needed food. So a short time after he left, he came back. I heard the door slam. I hear the footsteps upstairs, and I was kind of curious by what that all meant. And so I went upstairs to ask him, "Hey, man, what happened?" And he goes, "Oh, nothing. I just wanted to come home." I was like, okay. And I turned around, and as I'm walking out of his bedroom, I was like, something doesn't add up. And I went back in there, and I'm like, "Are you sure there's not something you want to tell me?" And he kind of, I could tell there was something he wanted to share, but he was like, "Well, I don't want to get anybody in trouble." And I'm like, "Well, you're not going to get anybody in trouble." And he goes on to tell me how he was at a friend's house. There was a firearm. It was unattended, and he said that he just wanted to leave. And it's hard to put into words at that moment how proud I was of him for actually doing, following the Eddie Eagle guidance, but he did. And so I tell this story because, it does work. It is important to share that with your children so that they have tools at their disposal. Because here's the thing, they're kids. They're curious. They are going to find ways if you don't address it yourself. And if you can address it, and if you could provide them with a process, it helps to kind of curtail that curiosity. And then what happens is that when you do want to introduce them to firearms, there's less of an anxiety. Now, the next thing that I did was, after they had the safety rules down, after they had the Eddie Eagle mantra down, and I would spot check this on a whim randomly, like, what's the third safety rule? Tell me the Eddie Eagle. And so they got to the point where they could do this. So the next thing I did was I introduced them to Nomenclature. And basically I drew a very less than artistic firearm, and I labeled it with the different features and whatnot, and then we would go through and they would have to memorize each of these features, and at a certain point I would just point to a blank drawing and ask them to define all the features, and they got to the point where they could do that well. And then the next thing that I did was I started to introduce the operation of a firearm, so how to load it, how to unload it, how to perform a safety check. And as they became more familiar with the firearm, they were able to point out the features very easily on a live firearm. Even though my stick rendering wasn't very artistic, they were still able to do that. And then lastly, we eventually worked to the point where we went to the range for the very first time, and they got a chance to fire their firearm, which I had a small little .22 single action rifle that they got a chance to use as their first firearm. And it was a wonderful experience that paved the way for many, many range trips as a family. And to this day, they still take firearm safety very seriously, and they still demonstrate safety anytime I'm around, at least, that I see and observe. So the process worked. And I really encourage families that want to introduce their love of or their passion for firearms to their children, that there is a process that you should probably think about, and it's a family-involved process, and it's one that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. It's one that you have to put thought into about age appropriateness. But when you do, you'll find that you have taken something that is important and you have diluted it down to little bite-sized pieces that the kids can take in and digest at a time, at little parts at a time. And it, in my case, seemed to have worked really well. So I would love to hear any other stories or anecdotes about your experience with firearms, how your family might have introduced them to you, or how you're trying to introduce them to your family. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to post them down below. Until then, take care and stay safe.